So, welcome everybody to the CNS Research Showcase this week. We are looking forward to a really fantastic talk by Miggy. So first, to get the official part out of the way, the CNS Research Showcase is a bi-weekly research event organized by our lab, Kadi Bono's lab, in the Department of Intelligent Systems Engineering, where we invite external and sometimes internal speakers to present research and development as it is relevant to our mission, which is typically data visualization and atlasing efforts. We are also very happy to be part of the caretaking group of Amatria, which I'm sure Miggy is going to cover in his talk to a certain degree. So Miggy himself is a composer, artist, and also we are lucky to have him as an IT user support specialist here in our school. And the title of today's talk will be Autopoietic Bloom, a musical improvisation engine for sentient architectural systems. Miggy, the stage is yours.
Yay, thank you. Thanks so much for the introduction, Andy. And big thanks to your group for inviting me to talk. This is super exciting. Let me share my screen and we can get started here. I'm on a Windows machine today, which is sacrilegious, I know, since I'm the Mac person here, but pay no attention to the activate Windows on the bottom right. So, Autopoietic Bloom. As Andy said, it's a mood-based improvisation engine for sentient architecture systems. My name is Miggy Torres, and I am a composer and artist. Just a little breakdown of today's talk. I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself, a quick summary of what Autopoietic Bloom is, and then we'll talk about sort of the aesthetic and conceptual underpinnings of the project, just sort of the things that I sort of hope to achieve with the project on an artistic level. And then we'll talk a little bit about the technical details, followed by a demo. And usually I leave the demo to the end, but this time I put it in the middle because there's some other things that I wanted to address that kind of, it helps if you know how it sounds to sort of reflect on that. So without further ado, as Andy mentioned, my name is Miggy Torres. These are my credentials, if you care about them. I studied for here at IU, and I also studied for a summer in IRCAM in France at their Center for Electronic Music. And my music tends to be pretty interdisciplinary, but I'm really just interested in creating kind of immersive experiences for audience members and things like that. I also want to introduce you to Amatria, if you're unfamiliar with the sculpture. So Amatria looks like this. It is a giant sentient sculpture, quote unquote, that hangs from the 4th floor of Luddy Hall at IU. And it was designed by the Ontario-based Living Architecture Systems group led by Philip Beasley, the architect. It is basically a set of fractured spheres with a polymer mesh canopy that is equipped with sensors and actuators that enreads visitors in the surrounding architecture. And it has sensors and things, and so it can respond to its surroundings with lights. And I'll show you in a minute these little plastic fronds that vibrate that let it make sort of this sound of like wind through leaves, as well as sounds through its speakers. So this is a schematic of where the speakers are. If you're looking sort of from a top-down view, if you imagine this is the staircase, and these are, oopsie, my mouse is very sensitive. Let me go back. And these are all the speakers, where the endpoints of these lines. So there's 3 speakers in the big sphere, 1 speaker in the small sphere, and then 6 that are kind of splayed across the spar field over here. This area, we call it the spar field. In today's demonstration, I've set it up so you'll be able to experience a kind of simulated version of this. The piece includes an ambisonic module, so it'll sort of sound as though you're standing where all of these intersection points are. So just bear that in mind for the demo. And then this is sort of a close-up of, you can see there's 1 speaker, and then these are little acrylic fronds, have little motors attached to them, which can help them vibrate in different ways and create a really, really lovely sound. So what is Autopoietic Bloom? Autopoietic Bloom is a mood-based gestural improvisation engine for multi-channel living architecture systems. It is a suite of 24 or so improvisational schemata, as well as custom software for the real-time interpretation and performance of those schemata by compatible living systems, or living architecture systems, in this case, Amatria. So with Autopoietic Bloom, Amatria can compose and perform a musical work that's unique every single time. Each improvisation is a non-repeatable event, an expression of uniqueness of identity, and most importantly, an opportunity for human connection. And the uniqueness of the aesthetic experience implicitly connects listeners as they experience together a shared musical event that will never happen again. So we can sort of dive right into the conceptual underpinnings of the piece. I started as my point of departure asking some of the same questions that Living Architecture Systems Group, the folks who made the sculpture, that they had been asking as part of their ongoing research. And I did that because I really wanted to create something that could really be integrated with the sculpture itself. You could theoretically just create any sort of 10-channel piece, but I really wanted something that could coexist peacefully and in harmony with the sculpture. So the central questions to their research are things like, can architecture integrate living functions? Could future buildings think or care? How do humans respond to these evolving interactions in a process of mutual adaptation? And so I took these questions a little bit further in my own direction and asked things like, can living architecture help people create social or parasocial relationships with their environments? What would the nature of those relationships be? How can living architecture mediate social relationships among people? What role does sound play in that mediation? And how can people connect with each other through a shared sound environment? And so in coming up with these questions, I ended up coming up with a list of desiderata for the project. And you'll notice I have here, I'm qualifying that word with the term phenomenological. And that's because I'm really most concerned with how people experience the work. I'm less concerned with like the ontology of the system, of like what the system actually is under the hood. I think that's all really interesting, and I think it's really cool. But the most important thing for me is how people actually experience the artwork. So we'll go through these one by one. So first, I wanted to create a musical experience that allows people to deepen their relationship with the architecture of Luddy Hall and with each other as mediated through their relationship with Amatria. So I want to talk briefly about time and space as a mediator of human relationships. So does anyone here recognize this? Does anyone recognize this pic? I don't know if I can see everyone's hands because I'm sharing my screen, but if you do recognize this pic, it's probably because you went to Cornell University or maybe Ithaca College, because this is a pic of Cornell University. This is a place called The Slope, and it's a spot in Cornell that has an incredible view. And you can see over here on the right, we have the lake, which is Cayuga Lake, and the sun sets across this hill or over this hill. So I didn't take this pic. This was just a pic that I found. But I have gone walking around Cornell many, many times. And one evening in I think it was 2015, I was walking by the slope, and I noticed that the sunset was especially beautiful that evening. And I decided I was just going to stop and watch the sunset for a while. And as I was standing there, people were, walking around, and I noticed after a minute or two that someone had stopped a few feet away from me and started watching the sunset as well. And after a few more minutes, another person, and then another person, and another person. And suddenly we had maybe like half a dozen people all standing there watching this sunset. And then the second that the sun went over the horizon, we all kind of just silently dispersed. And it was this really beautiful moment where we were all sort of being connected by this unique aesthetic experience. We didn't say anything to each other. We didn't know each other. We didn't really have to, but we could still feel really connected through being able to experience this thing as a group. So that was a big goal of mine for this project, inspired by that experience. Next was that I wanted to create a musical experience that deepens the sense that Amatria is alive, to create a sense of biomimesis, and this is sort of where the title for the project comes from. So I was really inspired by Amatria's behavior engine, which controls her lights and the vibrating plastic fronds. The way that behavior engine works, the exact behaviors are influenced but not explicitly controlled. So you can specify them parametrically at a high level, but you can't explicitly say, I want this light to turn on right now. You can do things like tell it, how bright to make the lights, or you can tell it how frequently to turn them on, or things like that. But you can't say, I want this light to be turned on right now. Another thing I wanted to do is to kind of help personify the sculpture. I mean, we already referred to the sculpture as like with the feminine pronoun and say she, which helps to personify it. But I was thinking, how can I do that through a musical project? So the goal here was to give Amatria agency over the music, so that she's sort of capable of introspection, and she can decide what to sing, and she can decide when to sing, and that could really center Amatria as the composer of the music. In many ways, the ability to create something implies life, and especially the ability to make choices about what you're creating implies life. And so therein lies the inspiration for the title, Autopoietic Bloom. The word autopoiesis, if you're in the field of complex systems theory or cognitive science and some parts of biology, you may have heard this term before. It comes from the Greek auto, meaning self, and poiesis, meaning creation or production. And the idea is that it's a way of describing a living system. Components using its own components. So fancy word, but that's what it means. And so here, the word is used metaphorically. Autopoietic bloom isn't an autopoietic system in the strictest sense, by no means. But from a metaphorical sense, it is, in the sense that as Amatria gives life to music, the music gives life to Amatria. The idea that the music is, it makes us feel as though she's creating it, and so that kind of gives us the feeling that she's alive. So these next three I might just sort of go over very, very quickly because for the sake of time. Number 3 here was I wanted to situate the observer in the same sacred time and space. The term sacred here comes from sort of anthropological understandings of what sacred is. But the general idea was that I wanted to kind of blur the line between when you are experiencing the art and when you're not experiencing the art of Amatria. I wanted to sort of blur the boundary of where that artistic experience is. Number 4 is pretty self-explanatory, just something that has a life beyond a single performance, so it's different every time. And then finally, I wanted something that would respect and preserve Amatria's artistic identity as a sculpture and quasi-living thing. So I wanted to get out of the way of her original sound design. So cool. Let's dive into the technical details here. So in designing this software, I knew I had to have a few things at the beginning. So I wanted it to be able to think like a musician, as opposed to, say, thinking like a computer scientist or like a mathematician. The ways of processing data needed to be musical from the very beginning. And so there were a minimum number of necessary modules that it would need to have in order to work properly and be musical in the way that I wanted it to. It also needed to be flexible and extensible so it can integrate with Amatria's existing systems, as well as any systems that it may eventually get, because Amatria is always growing. So, for this piece, all the improvisations are predefined parametrically at a musically high level. Again, I was inspired by the behavior engine of the sculpture. And so I wanted to do a similar thing, but with music. So what happens is that the different parameters for each improvisation are selected in response to local weather patterns. So why local weather patterns? That might seem a little bit arbitrary, but really this point here about Amatria responding empathically to people without collecting biometric data, that's a really important, that was a really important thing to me with this piece. If I want a sculpture that's going to respond to her environment, how is it going to get that information? How is it going to be able to understand like what the overall mood of a community is? Well, you can either, get really big brothery and try to surveil people and collect biometric data, whether that biometric data is extremely personal, like your blood pressure or your heartbeat, or if it's maybe more superficial, like are you smiling or not. There's the specter of Big Brother is still hangs very thick in the zeitgeist, and even more so nowadays when we know that tech companies are constantly harvesting our data. So I wanted a way for the sculpture to relate to people on an emotional level, but in kind of an indirect way. And so with weather patterns are things that happen every day that we might not think about very, very often, but they can very greatly affect our mood. And so that's sort of the thought process there behind having her tap into weather patterns and use that data to determine how she improvises. So the parameters can be defined by anyone, but only Amatria can author the actual music, in the sense that she is making musical decisions on a granular level, even though on improvisational scheme twice, the overall kind of emotion and flavor of it will be the same. Cool. So let's talk about the actual software components here. So we have an activation manager, which basically just turns it on and off. We have the weather data retrieval system. We have a growing library of what will eventually be 24 parametrically defined improvisational schemata. We have the improvisation engine itself, which is really the star of the show, and we have an ambisonic spatializer that you will be able to that we'll be using so that you can actually hear this in sort of like a 3D kind of sound. And then on top of that, we also have a visualizer, which allows you to even more closely visualize what's going on if you're sort of standing in front of the sculpture, or even like if you're here at home and you want to have a better idea of what speakers are playing what voice. So the whole thing was coded and built in Max MSP. For anyone who hasn't heard of Max MSP, it's a very, very kind of industry standard program for doing anything with live electronics. And there's also a video component that a lot of people use these days. Mine doesn't really use that, but it uses all the audio stuff. And it also makes use of a few libraries, Bach, Cage, and Spat5, which I'll explain what those are a little bit later. So this is a diagram of sort of the information flow in Autopoietic Bloom. It looks a little bit complex, but really the main important things are these four modules. So the idea is that your data from the improvisational scheme gets loaded into this module here, which sort of distributes real-time values to all the other modules. Meanwhile, your main gesture, the main musical gesture that's going to be used in a particular situation, moves through all of these transformations and then gets sent over to the synthesizer itself, which then will send that to the channel mixer and then out to the speakers. So pretty straightforward. I want to talk first about Donatoni generator. So this makes use of the Bach library for Max, which is a computer-aided composition package for Max. So it's really just a large set of Max objects and abstractions for working with musical structures algorithmically, written by Andrea Agostini and Daniele Ghisi. And the wonderful thing about Bach is that it uses Lisp-like linked lists to represent musical data. A Lisp-like linked list is essentially just a nested array. It's an array inside of an array inside of an array. And that works really, really well for communicating musical data and for representing musical data, because music is such a hierarchical thing. You have notes, and you have chords, and you have melodies, and you have measures. And so all these different components exist on different levels, different hierarchical levels. And so it's a really wonderful tool to use for representing and transforming musical structures. So Donatoni, which is the gesture-based note generator, manipulates these lists in real time and then sends 4-voice MIDI data to the synthesizers. So when the information comes out of the the gesture-based note generator, it's just music data. It's not sound yet. It has to go to the synthesizers to turn into sound. And there are 4 voices. I could have done more voices. I suppose it could technically support up to 16 voices because MIDI has 16 channels. But if 4 is good enough for the Beatles, it's good enough for me. So next I'll talk about the multi-channel synthesizer here, which I've named syrinx. A syrinx, by the way, is an organ inside of some species of birds that let them sing 2 notes at once, basically. So Syrinx is a set of, I guess it's a set of 4 parametrically controlled synths, one for each Donatoni voice. Each voice supports up to 4 simultaneous control signals to shape sounds dynamically and improvisationally. The core is a very, very flexible semi-modular synth. And you can also use sample sounds in Absinthe 5, so your possibilities are basically endless. That really is the core of each one of the modules. And so you can what's really good about Absinthe 5 is that you can build your instrument, if you will. You can build your sound in advance, and then when you go to call the sound, you just call a preset. And so it's very little. You don't have to send tons of information through the system. You can just tell it what preset to use, and it'll automatically call that up. So super helpful. And then finally here we have Quincy, which is the dynamic mixer. So what Quincy does is it takes the signals from Syrinx's 4 voices, and it distributes them to Amatria's 10 speakers. And it does so in ways that can change over the course of a song, of a piece. It can do so improvisationally, algorithmically, and in tempo. So this uses similar algorithms as Donatoni to represent speaker configurations as Lisp-like linked lists and manipulate those in real time and then decode them into actual ons and offs and ins and outs and things like that. So if we were to take all of these things together, right, Quincy plus Syrinx plus Donatoni, the note generator, the synthesizer, and the channel mixer, it would sound really cool, but it would still sort of just be a sophisticated programmable wind chime, in the sense that you would have it doing this one thing for 5 minutes and then it would stop. But it wouldn't really have a sense of trajectory. And so I really wanted something that could turn the wind chimes into a musical aesthetic experience, to turn sound events into organized musical work, to turn noise into a song, soundscape into narrative, what Eric Satie might call furniture music into something we might call concert music, and from recitative into aria. And so it needed to do that. It needs something that can create kind of an overarching formal organization, or something that can allow the music to transform over time. And so the solution to this is Zoe, which is the interpolation engine. Zoe is the Greek word for life, which is where that comes from. And the idea behind Zoe is that it imbues each unique song with artistic intent. With Zoe, you get dramatic trajectory, motivation, shape, transformation, metamorphosis, all can be interpolated over the length of the composition. So you can sort of think of it as you can think of each improvisational scheme as sort of an n-dimensional graph where n is 235, where each of those is a single parameter that is sort of changing or being interpolated over the course of the piece. So with this module, Amatria can now improvise music that has climaxes and beginnings and middles and ends and narratives and nadirs and accelerandi, etc., instead of just doing this one thing and then stopping or whatever. And because of the way it's written, the number of points between which it can interpolate are virtually endless, although presumably you wouldn't want too many. But the point really is that each song can have its own shape, which is really important. So I think now the demonstration, I'm going to share the screen on my other computer. Oopsie, because that's where it is. Actually, before we do that, there are a couple of slides I just want to show you to prime you for what you're going to hear. So this song is let me go over here. The piece you're going to hear is the song that's associated with the rainfall weather pattern, and this form especially showcases the improvisational process, especially in the second voice, which you'll hear as a kind of playful percussive kalimba-like sound, and you'll also experience this kind of in stereo as if you're standing at, in situ in front of the sculpture. Great. So that's Autopoietic Bloom for you, or at least that's one of the many songs that it can create and that the sculpture can create. So I want to talk briefly now a little bit about stabilizing Amatria's sound system. So Amatria's sound system is built using Dante, which is an audio over Ethernet protocol. So it includes 6 Dante devices that look like this on the sculpture itself. You'll see you have like Ethernet in and then XLR out, so it's going from digital to analog, and then it all connects to an iMac, which is in the control room for Amatria. So for all of these to work properly, they all need to have their own clock synchronization, or they all need to be synchronized to the same clock. And normally, the Dante protocol is really good at doing that. But every once in a while, you can have disruptions to the clock synchronization, which will cause certain parts of the system not to work. So that's kind of what's happening to Amatria, and I'm not totally sure why. What ends up happening is if I were to have played this in person, after maybe 5 minutes, the audio would have become kind of crackly, and then it would have just slowly started to fall silent on its own. And then you can't get it to make any more sound after that until you sort of restart the computer. And so what's going on is that the iMac is losing clock sync with the rest of the system. And again, I'm not totally sure why. So this is kind of a very brief schematic of the system, right? You have the iMac in the control room, which is connected to the network infrastructure of the sculpture, which includes Ethernet cables and power over Ethernet switches. And then that connects to the Dante device, which converts the signal into analog and sends it out to the rest of the audio components, like the amplifier and the speaker and everything like that. And so all the troubleshooting that needs to happen should happen over here in this part of the signal path, because this is the part that's breaking down a little bit. So some possible explanations: it could be that the iMac's Ethernet port itself is inhibiting clock sync. There's some literature about that might be the case. It could be something with our PoE switches up there in the sculpture. It could be perhaps a faulty Ethernet cable, though unlikely. Or it could also be a faulty Dante device, but again, I kind of think that's unlikely because they all seem to be working fine. So how would we begin to remedy this? Well, one thing I would like to do at some point is to remove a Dante device from the sculpture itself and just connect it directly to the iMac. And if it works, then that means the problem is something with the network infrastructure. And if it doesn't work, then that means the problem is with the iMac, or less likely would be the Dante device. So that's something I'd like to do with the help of CNS in the next, in the coming months or whatever. Next, I want to talk about Peripatetic Bloom, which is simply Autopoietic Bloom on the road. I had the pleasure of bringing Autopoietic Bloom with me this summer to the Nifnor Festival, which is a contemporary music festival in Knoxville, Tennessee, where two of my pieces were premiered, and Autopoietic Bloom, the mobile version, was installed in the Natalie L. Haslam Music Center there in Knoxville. There was a quadraphonic setup, so it wasn't 10 speakers, it was just 4. But the ambisonic module worked the same way as it did today. And then we projected images of Amatria, Luddy Hall, and of Mood Oracle, which is the visualization system that you only saw for like a minute or two. And this was installed for 7 days, and about 40 or 50 people came through, and it was really great. But the highlight of Autopoietic Bloom's time at this festival was a collaborative improvisational performance where several of the performers there wanted to play music with the sculpture. So these folks included Liam Flaherty from Carnegie Mellon, Armand Dorsey from Dartmouth, and Susie Ling from Duke, who are all on these various instruments: piano, clarinet, and toy piano / melodica. So I want to play just a minute of that. This is a really long recording, but I'll just play a short bit of it so you can hear what they did. Oh, I have to share. Hold on. I think I have to share my sound. My bad. Let me do this again. Stop sharing. New share sound. Okay. Here we go. Oops. Needs to go back to here. Okay. Can you hear that? So I'll pause it there for the sake of time, but you get the idea. Really beautiful. These musicians are much more used to doing way more crunchy, dissonant stuff. So I think it's nice that they're kind of trying to. You can hear them trying to inject some of that into the sound, which I think is really lovely. Great. And then finally, to conclude, I want to talk about the preliminary impact on the Luddy community. I say preliminary partly because, as I mentioned, there's still some audio issues with the sculpture that are sort of inhibiting Autopoietic Bloom from really being as stable as it could be. And then also, there's only this one, so far there's only that one improvisational scheme composed, so there's a lot more composition to be done before it really becomes its complete self. But I had an experience recently where I think it was in May of this year, where I was showing off the sculpture to a friend of mine, and I was showing them Autopoietic Bloom as well. And I went into the control room and I pushed play and I came out and we stood there and we listened to the piece. And after a minute or two, a couple of students started to peek their heads out of the focus rooms, and then a minute later they would start walking up to the sculpture, and after a few minutes, by the middle of the song, we were all standing there underneath the sculpture and listening to the piece. And after it ended, we all dispersed away in silence. And so it was the exact same thing that happened here at Cornell. And for me as an artist, it was just one of the most validating experiences in the world, that the thing that I wanted to have happen actually happened. So I think it was a really wonderful experience and validating experience. And I'm really hoping to get Autopoietic Bloom to reaching its full potential very soon. And then I forgot why I put this picture in here, but this is just a picture of the little display that we have out there, where it has the visualization system there, as well as some more information about the project. So I think if that's everything, I'm just going to say a couple thank yous. Big thank you to LASG, Philip Beasley, Matt and Rob Gorbet, and Michael Lancaster. Big thank you to IU, especially Kati and Andy, for just giving me the space and freedom to do this project, as well as for the invite here today. And a big thank you to all the folks who developed the software and who taught me how to use the software that I use to make Autopoietic Bloom. So with that, are there any questions?
That was fantastic work, Miggy. Thank you so much. So yeah, the floor is now open for questions.
Oh,
yes, please, John, go ahead.
Can I go ahead? Can you hear me?
I only hear you out of my left ear.
Maybe the problem is mine, actually.
I think it might be.
So I was really interested in what you had to say about surveillance and how you didn't want to do that. And so you substituted the weather, data stream for that, which is really great. I haven't really thought too much about that, though I'm kind of dimly aware of the issue. But nevertheless, Amatria, is built with all those sensors that are sensing something about the environment, but not something quite as personal as your heart rate or whatever. What does it sense exactly?
It senses, so it has a set of infrared sensors that can detect when something walks by, and then it has sensors, I believe, if amplitude goes above it sounds like an impulse signal or something like that.
But I guess if people are kind of standing there in a trance, nothing happens with that data stream particularly. So maybe the weather is really great for other reasons too.
Yeah, no, you're correct. Yeah, if people are just standing there, then they might not necessarily do that. But at the same time, I think part of what makes the installation really cool is that when you're there in person, you have the ability to walk around, and when you walk around, it changes what you hear and changes what's coming out of what speaker. And so when I heard it for the first time in real life, I was really excited because walking around, you can just hear different things. And so I suppose if someone were just standing at that little kiosk that we have, then maybe they would just stand there. But I think my hope is that people should be encouraged to walk around the space and to sort of, do that.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, it's a great piece, and it's really fun to hear about and to hear the sound world. And It's really
Thanks.
great that you're doing this. Oh, just one last thing.
Hmm.
You should probably talk to Haley Strong over in audio because they deal with Dante all the time. They might
Oh,
have an idea or two.
nice. Okay, yeah, heck yeah. Thank you. Yes, Devin. Hi.
Yeah, hello, hello. Great stuff. It's really exciting to see, music, the very creative interact with technology, right? In doing so, there's a lot of translation that has to go through. So, say we were pulling information from the current climate and the weather of that given time. How did you interpret those parameters into, say, a synthesizer, which is something that's so clearly defined and less flexible in a way as opposed to weather?
Yeah, great question. Any time that you do sonification of something that isn't sound, you're always going to be making some sort of arbitrary choices about how you're doing that. And I really didn't even really want to do something that was as concrete as sonification. I wanted to do something that was way more metaphorical. So for me, there are some specific pieces of weather data that do control explicit things. For example, the humidity controls how much reverb you get, right? Or the wind speed can control a tempo multiplier and things like that. But for other things, like partly rainy, mostly sunny, how do you translate that into some sort of musical quantitative value? Well, you really can't. And so the way that Autopoietic Bloom works, based on the weather pattern, it'll choose a pre-written scheme, so a pre-written set of high-level instructions, which are composed as subjectively as any other piece of music would be, but really with an attention to connecting with people through mood. So maybe that's not a satisfying question, or maybe it is a satisfying answer. But that's kind of how I went about going from one of those ideas to the other one of those ideas.
Yeah, I think it's very cool. There's this kind of theme of I kind of see between what you're saying of like the sensory experience of weather and how humans experience it, right? It juxtaposed to say how Amatria receives input. Very cool.
Thanks. Yeah. Yes, Colin Murphy.
Hey, Miggy. Thank you for the presentation, and it's always a pleasure to hear Autopoietic Bloom. I have kind of a two-pronged question. It's really interesting to me. I don't think it occurred to me how much like personhood is tied into Autopoietic Bloom and the importance of personhood. And I'm curious why personhood is so important as opposed to AI. I mean, we interact with AI stuff, like especially all the AI art that we're seeing all the time, like the generated stuff right now. Like I think people are comfortable with that without feeling, I mean, as presently the big brother feeling, or why not something that's just like you're trying to make it resemble nature as opposed to personhood, like with the sun example at the beginning. And then, so talking a little bit about importance of personhood. And then my other question is, if technological limitation were not an issue, like what would the personhood goal, like the extent, like what things would you wish you could explore more? Like I think the fact that people were called to do an improvisation with it is really exciting. Like are there further examples that you could see, like if you really could take it to its full extent, what would those examples be? Where would it go? Thanks again.
Yeah, a great question. So I think personhood is really important for me with this project because going back to those initial questions about can we establish a social relationship with something? And human beings are ridiculously good at creating social relationships with inanimate objects. We do it all the time, and in fact, there are entire schools of religious anthropology that sort of explain cultural worldviews as people creating social relationships with inanimate objects. So for me, having it resemble something that's more of a person, I think, was my way of exploring that idea, and also trying really hard to not fall into the uncanny valley where you almost become a person, but your skin is made of glass or something. So I think that was the big part of it. And I do enjoy a lot of the AI art that I've seen. But as a composer myself, mean, obviously it's tinged with, my questions about AR are sort of tinged with the bias of the question of, am I going to be replaced in 20 years? But it's also, I don't know, there's something about, AI art is always going to have some kind of bias, right? It's always going to have a bias based on its data set. And the data set is biased based on the person who made the data set or who's feeding it the data set. So at the end of the day, I mean, in some ways, that's just as subjective as what I have done, you know? And by the same token, as a composer, and maybe this is a bigger part of it, is as a composer, my music it tends to be really specific. Like, apart from this, if you look at my scores, I mean, they are really, I mean, you've seen them, Colin. They're really nitty gritty, and they tell people, I want you to do this with your instrument right now, and then half a second later or whatever, I want the other person to do something totally different. So part of me wanted to kind of retain authorship, and so part of the personhood in Amatria is actually my own, or in Autopoietic Bloom is my own personhood that I'm trying to preserve instead of give it up to a machine. And the second part of your question, there are certain limitations to Autopoietic Bloom that I wish I could have. Maybe for Autopoietic Bloom 2.0 we can try to fix to deal with them. But for example, each voice is solipsistic in the sense that it doesn't hear what the other voices are doing and can't respond to what the other voices are doing. It also uses a iterative algorithm instead of a recursive algorithm, which is not how humans improvise. Humans improvise recursively by listening to ourselves and to other people and then building off of that. And so Autopoietic Bloom can't listen to other musicians. It can only listen to itself. And if it could have listened to other musicians, then you would have heard all those other dissonances that those other musicians were playing in response to those musicians. So that would be something that I would like. It would be interesting to see what a sort of satisfying implementation of deep learning might be for this project. I haven't thought of one yet, but I'm sure there is one. So does that answer your question? Nice.
I also have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So the topic of surveillance was already mentioned. So I think this can kind of go both ways. You know, you can interact with a sculpture in public and you can feel surveilled by it, but you could also feel noticed and kind of cared for lack of a better term. So my question to you is, where do you think is that line, and how could your music help, kind of push the visitor towards more feeling like just noticed and welcomed rather than being surveilled?
Yeah. Well, I think that line is relatively close to where that line would be if you were talking to someone in real life. So if I went up to you, Andy, and I said, "What's your blood pressure? Like, are you sad? Do you need cheering up?" Like, if I did that to you like every day, like, wouldn't you feel wouldn't you be like, "Can you lay off? Can you please just I just want to be left alone?" So that's sort of how I feel with regards to technology as well. I also think that one thing that separates technology from human beings is that technology has a ostensibly perfect memory, and it's through the degradation of memory that we get to keep our privacy from each other in some ways. If I do some embarrassing thing in the front of everybody, I take solace in the fact that they will not remember it, hopefully, in a week or two. Whereas if a machine can see everything about you and record all of that and keep it forever, that's a lot more disconcerting. So I think that's another thing that kind of separates how we think about privacy regarding people versus a machine. As far as the music goes, I think it's a couple of things. It can be that you feel cared for by the sculpture because you are aware that the sculpture is living in the same time and place as you are. When you enter that artistic space, you're normally imagine you're walking from a street into a cathedral, and now suddenly you're full of there's all these symbols that are changing the way that you see reality. And it's the same for an artistic space. When you enter into an installation or you walk up in front of Amatria, you're sort of half transported into this other world. And creating a component of Amatria that kind of keeps it tethered to the outside world, to the world beyond the walls of Luddy Hall, I think is a really great way of helping people to realize that Amatria exists in the here and now and not in some timeless future. The cliche that people say all the time is liminal space, but I think that it's a good description here, that you're living in that blurred line between your mundane life and this kind of sacred art. And then the other way that I think it can help people is the way that I describe sort of the preliminary impact, which is like there's something about sharing an experience with other people that helps you feel, I'm going to get emotional, it helps you feel a little bit less alone. And I think that's such an important thing for art to do. And so I think that if the technology can bring people together with each other, then that's a way in which we can all feel a lot better in general. It's not necessarily just that I'm being cared for by the sculpture directly, but that I'm being cared for by the sculpture because the sculpture is uniting me with my community. So that's my answer.
That was beautifully said. And my question was based on, many people that come to visit Amatria or that we give tours to, that's the first thing they ask. Can it see me? Can it hear me? Can it feel me? And then you explain to them, those sensors are so simplistic, and you would need to have somebody on the back end making sense of it, and that typically takes it away for them. But maybe, when we play them Autopoietic Bloom, they're not going to have those worries or concerns anymore.
Maybe, hopefully.
I'm 100% sure that playing Autopoietic Bloom at our upcoming tours is going to add yet another element of community to these tours when we give them. We couldn't give them for 2 years because of COVID, so this is actually even better.
Yay.
Right,
Anything else? It's almost pizza time for us here at Luddy. So
nice. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Miggy, for this fantastic talk. This was really outside of the usual for our team. So very, very glad. Also, thanks everybody from Jacobs and other departments coming over to join us here. This was fantastic. Miggy, we will share a recording of this talk with you. And with that, I wish everybody a pleasant afternoon.
Yay. Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.